Hello and welcome to my podcast. Do me a favor, subscribe to the John Keim Report wherever you get your podcast. You're watching on YouTube, like button, subscribe button. You can find us there as part of Ampire Media. That's Ampire. Always much appreciated whenever you tune in. And also check out on Ampire the college football preview show Between the Hashes by my son Matthew. Gives really good information to set you up for the big college games every weekend. That's Between the Hashes, already up right now. Check it out. Also, at the start of the hockey season, you have the All's Cap podcast by Steve Wino, AP hockey writer, and former Washington Capital Carl Alsner. It gives you really good insight into the hockey season as well as the Capitals. Today, I'll be joined by ESPN Green Bay Packers reporter Rob Demovsky. Yes, the Commanders have issues. So do the Packers. Now, I'm not going to compare the issues. One team's had a long run of success as one of the best quarterbacks of all time. Another team has had neither for a long time. But the Packers do have some issues: offensive line, receiver, and the defense run by your old pal, Joe Barry. It's a struggling team up there. They've lost 2 in a row. This is a highly winnable game for Washington. Will they do it? Well, I don't know. I'll talk about that on Friday in my Prediction and Keys podcast. But I do know it's a winnable game, and Rob will fill you in on what's going wrong with the Packers. So there you go. But before we get there, I wanted to go over a couple of things, starting with what happened Tuesday in New York when Indianapolis owner Jim Irsay said that there is merit to ousting Washington owner Dan Snyder. Highly, highly unusual statement for an owner to make about another owner. I just think it shows where a lot of owners are getting to in their frustration with the situation. A year ago, what you heard mostly was, don't want to set a bad precedent. Don't want to set a bad precedent. I think that sentiment has clearly shifted with a lot of owners. If you, just as a refresher course, go back and read the story on ESPN.com last week by Seth Wickersham, Don Van Natta Jr., and Tisha Thompson, and then you'll understand where a lot of owners are at. Irsay just came out publicly and stated where he was at. Now, Roger Goodell did come out and say he doesn't want anything more to be said until the investigation by Mary Jo White is complete, and they have all the information. That's obviously very important until you have all the information to withhold some stuff. But there is a growing sentiment based on what ESPN has heard, what others have heard, and then Irsay coming out and saying that's certainly a change, and it's certainly worth watching where this goes next. Now, the Snyders and the team did put out a statement, and it says in part that they called it highly inappropriate, but not surprising what Irsay said. They also said when they see the actual evidence in this case, Mr. Irsay will conclude there is no reason for the Snyders to consider selling the franchise, and they won't. So there you go. But again, all we know is highly unusual for Irsay to come out and say that, and it's definitely worth paying attention to. Again, last year at this time, setting a bad precedent. This time, there's more of a momentum toward at least considering other options in Washington as far as where this could go. I also would suggest going back and listening to Seth Wickersham, the podcast I did with him on Friday over the weekend, and he gives really good insight to set you up for the owners' meetings earlier this week. But I also think it's good information for you to know, and it'll explain more of what went into the Irsay comments and maybe what all that means. And I think it's hard. I think when you see that story, then you also hear Al Michaels on Thursday Night Football saying something about how perhaps it's been best for Snyder to sell, and then you have the Irsay comments. It just feels like this has been a little bit different. It's a perilous time for Snyder and his ownership. But again, we need to wait and see. As a reporter, I wait and see until all the facts are in. You get the Mary Jo White investigation done, and then go from there. All right, now let's get on the field and let's get to some injury updates. Receiver Jahan Dotson was limited in practice on Wednesday, but he's taken some steps to getting back on the field. There's some optimism for him on Sunday, but again, step by step, day by day. Tight end Logan Thomas, still dealing with the calf injury, was worked out on the side field, so did not participate in any practice. John Bates was on the side field as well. He has a hamstring injury, so the tight ends still remain a banged up group. And then also with some Carson Wentz remains out in LA, rehabbing that the right ring finger. And until we know, I think it'll probably be about Friday when they have a better idea of what's going to happen with him. Chase Young, We're still waiting for some updates on him, what Dr. Andrews told him as to whether or not he would begin practicing next week. If all goes well with that visit with Andrews, then he would practice next week. But need to know more, fill you in on the next podcast, which will come out Friday, my keys and predictions. So there you go. I also wanted to address one more thing before I get to my conversation with Rob, and that's with quarterback Sam Howell. I know there's a sentiment by some, not many, but by some, to see what do they have in Sam Howell. Well, first of all, coaches always know what they have. There's some surprise, but they know what a player has to work on with his footwork in the classroom, etc. So they're not, they don't need to see, just because fans or media need to see doesn't mean they need to see. And so, but some of the stuff with Howell goes back. And you saw, if you watched his interview that he did on Tuesday with the media, and it's up on Ampire Media if you want to go watch it. It's a little more than 2 minutes, but it's worth your time just to see, kind of explain some of what he's working on. That's footwork, and it's different from what he had in college. Part of the thing was, and this is, I heard this in the summer, and I've heard this during the season, that he is still working on his footwork, and a lot of it is marrying the footwork to the route. This is completely different for him than it was at North Carolina. So it's not just so-and-so with another team did it, so why can't he? He can do it too. They're different circumstances. And Howell even said that what he's asked to do here in terms of the footwork is very different from North Carolina. Some people may go to a system where the footwork is more similar. For example, at Carolina, they didn't have any 5-step drops out of the gun. They have that here. Then what you're doing too is some teams like, and you've heard Logan Paulson talk about this on his podcast, Take Command, where like Kyle Shanahan, that system is going to be different than this one is as far as the footwork goes and the hitches they build in within the flow of a route. In this one, Howell explained to a couple of us later that there are sometimes like a particular route might be 5-step drop and 1 hitch, but another route might be 5-step drops and 2 hitches. So you've got to get that timing down before you're ready to play. Those are the things that he's still working on. He is not, from what my understanding is, he's not there yet. And the coaches definitely consider there being a gap between Heineke and Howell. So you're not going to the other guy. And I'm honestly going to be tired of talking about this because it's not an option. And it's really not at this point at 2-4, it's not a worthy discussion because they're not having this discussion because they feel there is a gap. But I am letting you know where Howell is at with things. They seem to be happy with his progress, but they certainly aren't ready to put him in at a point in the season where they still have an opportunity if things get turned around to make some noise. You can laugh at that if you want. For them, though, it's about job survival and it's about feeling like they still have a chance. If you've ever played sports, if your team is 2-4, you look at the other teams and say, hey, if you can play better, you can get there. Again, you can laugh at it all you want. You can say they stink, they have no chance, but they don't think the same way you do. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to say that what they should do. It's not about what you or I think they should do to, whatever, or how we view it. It's how they view it. And they don't view it the same way. That's why they're going to Taylor Heineke. Again, it's not even a discussion that I want to have anymore because it's not one that's legitimate at this point. But I did want to fill you in on what are some of the things that Howell has to get used to before he gets on the field. And I think if you really want to see the kid succeed, you should want him to have that down to give him the best chance to succeed. I do think he could go out there and probably make some plays because he has the ability to run around. He has a good arm. I think there's some good qualities to build on. But I think to survive, you're going to have to get the other parts down as well. To flourish, to have a good chance. So there you go. Just wanted to give you a little bit about that. And I did tell you I was going to look into some of the things on hot routes and all that and adjustments. And I think I was told by one person, it's a discussion they're still having to build that in, but they need to have this happen because they're getting killed by these cover zero blitzes. And you need to have answers. And right now they don't, but it's something I'm going to keep asking other people about because I think it's a big deal because it's hurting them at this point. You need to start providing answers for the quarterback and for the receivers. So there you go. I'll be back just before I get to my conversation with Rob. A reminder, I'll be back on Friday with my keys and predictions to the game. But first, let's fill you in on the Green Bay Packers with my ESPN colleague in Green Bay, Rob Demovsky. All right, Rob, I'm used to talking about this team in a state of disarray or whatever. Why are they struggling? This is a little bit new for the Packers, especially under Matt LaFleur. So in general, what's been going wrong these last couple of weeks for the Packers?
John, the easy answer is, well, they don't have Devontae Adams. But it goes so much deeper than that in the sense of their offensive line just is completely out of sorts, right? Everybody thought, okay, they're going to get David Bakhtiari and Elton Jenkins back. Just, whether it's the new position or coming off the ACL, he just hasn't been the same. For a while, Bakhtiari wasn't able to play a full game. He was alternating series. So you got those issues up front. The Jets completely exposed stunts. I mean, it was like the Packers had never seen a twist or a stunt before. It was incredible. They don't have a consistent leading receiver. 6 games, 6 different guys have led them in receiving. And because the passing game has absolutely no deep threat, their 2 best players are probably Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon, running backs. They can't get them going. So, that's just on the offensive side of the ball, John. Like, that's just the starting point.
Well, sticking with that, because they obviously could and should run the ball better than they have been, but it really seems to be about number of carries versus effectiveness. Yeah. Is it just because teams are kind of stacking the box on them?
Yeah, offensive coordinator Adam Stenavich had an interesting comment last week, when we were like, well, why not just run the ball more? And he goes, look, we're not going to just run the ball into 8-man boxes. He goes, bad offenses do that. Bad offenses are stubborn. Good offenses don't do that. Well, he's probably right, but right now they're a bad offense doing it the way they're doing it. So John, Rogers said something interesting on the McAfee show. McAfee was trying to stir up, he likes to stir the pot a little bit.
Really?
He was talking about, I think he was basically trying to say, they need to get the ball to Aaron Jones more. He's trying to get Rodgers to say that. And Rodgers just said, here's how we get him the ball more. We get him the ball more. Like, he wasn't, it wasn't necessarily a shot at anybody. The problem is they just haven't been able to do that. And like, you look at their offense, he's their most dynamic player, right? His yards per carry is really high. When he catches the ball out of the backfield, he usually makes something happen. They just don't have enough attempts.
Rodgers also talked about, and you wrote about this after the game, simplifying the offense. You also wrote another story about like really what's going wrong here. And there's a multitude of things that's on ESPN.com right now. But the simplify stuff, was this the Rodgers speak? What were there veiled meanings behind that? Or was it as simple as, hey, you need to simplify it?
There's always veiled things behind what he says. You almost need a translator, someone who speaks Rodgers' language to figure out what he's trying to say. And look, he's taken little subtle shots at LaFleur this year. I mean, coming out of the London game, he didn't mention LaFleur by name, but he's like, I didn't like some of the messaging that was coming out of from coaches and players about the trip to London. Look, and LaFleur made no secret about he didn't really like the trip. And so, like, he's taking little shots there. I don't think this is like, this isn't Rodgers trying to start a mutiny at all. I think it's him realizing that the season could go one way or the other, and he's trying to, sort of steer it back on course. The interesting thing is, so after the game, he says we need to simplify the offense. We ask him what that means. He says, well, less motion. Well, the next day, LaFleur goes, well, we hardly ran any motion the first couple of series. And then the next day, Rodgers comes back and says, well, I was really speaking more that the players need to get a grasp of things. So it's this, he said, she said cycle. But look, he has never liked motion. Like, he made that abundantly clear.
Why not?
Who knows? I think because it probably takes away some of his ability to just stand there, let the play clock run down, and sort of read what's happening. But the whole idea of motion is to create mismatches, right? And tell you what the defense is doing.
Right.
So they have run a little less motion. ESPN Stats and Info is great with these numbers. They've actually run less motion this year than they have the last 2 years. And the first year under LaFleur, they hardly ran any motion. And that was LaFleur trying to basically figure out how they can run the stuff Rodgers likes and run the stuff he likes and make it all one thing. So my guess is it's mostly about Rodgers not liking pre-snap motion.
So last thing on the offense, and I'll get to defense for a few minutes, but when you talk about the line, the stunts, and the problems they had against that with the Jets, this line does like to run some stunts and some stuff up front. Why were there so many problems with that?
Yeah, I mean, those guys will say communication. I still think it's a couple things. It's one, I mean, Elton Jenkins is a really, really good guard, Pro Bowl guard, and he's not playing guard, right? And where do you need stunts inside, right? I mean, like they got beat inside so many times on those stunts. It wasn't twisting around the outside. It was inside. Royce Newman, their right guard, they benched him during the game, John, and this guy Jake Hansen comes in for one series. They march down the field, get a field goal out of it, and he hurts his bicep, and they have to put Royce Newman, the guy they just benched, back in the game, right? So they had made a in-game benching, which is pretty rare for these guys. So that tells you how severe they thought they needed a change. And then the change they made, they couldn't stick with it because the guy gets hurt. And the other thing too, like David Bakhtiari said this to me after the game when I asked him about these stunts. He's like, "Look, what we showed or didn't show that we couldn't handle it, it's blood in the water now. Like,
Yeah.
teams are just gonna keep doing it until we show we can figure it out." So what you're saying about Washington being a team that likes to do it, and then them seeing what the Jets did, I mean, I would fully expect whatever they have in the playbook in terms of those kind of pass rushes,
Using it
they're just going to throw it at them.
defensively. Joe Barry, this fan base knows him well, and his defenses, and they're struggling. And there were a lot of, like, you could see the Packers offense without Adams taking
Yeah.
maybe a slight step back, right?
Yep.
The defense, though, what's going on there? Because they struggled.
They have 7 first-round picks on defense. They have 4 high-priced free agents that they brought in from the outside. Some of them are on second contracts, and they're a mess. In training camp, Rodgers kept saying, "Well, like you said, we knew the offense was going to be a work in progress, but hey, this defense is really good. Look what they're doing." The defense won. They won more days in training camp than I've ever seen a defense win against Rodgers. Well, it turns out maybe they were winning because the offense stinks even worse than we thought, right?
I've seen that.
Devondre Campbell, all pro linebacker last year, had a great year, not playing well. He's probably missed more tackles this year than he did all last year combined. Rasul Douglas, who was really sort of the star of the secondary last year, he had 5 interceptions from week 8 on it. He wasn't even on the team until mid-October. He played so well outside, and this year he's playing in the slot because Jair Alexander is back. Well, he's just not he's not as good in the slot as he is outside. They're playing so much zone, which, as you know, Joe Barry's, well, it's probably a different system because when he went out to LA, he kind of got the Brandon Staley kind of defense.
Right.
It's so much zone. And just like the communication has been bad on the offensive line, it's been terrible on defense. Like they're just, you see before the snap, I mean, they're just guys pointing all over the place and no one knows, what's going on. Now, last week they did play a lot more man. I'm not sure there was the defense actually played better. I know the score looked a little lopsided, but the defense, they kept them in the game for a while and the offense just couldn't keep up. But look, I mean, Joe Barry, we said this when they hired him. His defenses in Washington were 28th and 29th, and in Detroit they were 32nd, 31st. And the thing was, well, okay, he didn't have the talent there that he has here. And look, last year they were good defensively, but their rankings were super high. I think they were 9th overall, and they were around top 12 in pretty much every category. But the one category they weren't was rushing average. Like teams were running at 5 yards a clip against these guys. And now because the Packers were winning, teams weren't rushing all that much. But when they did, super effective. And now that teams are getting leads on these guys, John, they're able to run the ball and just completely exposing their run defense, which is surprising because they've got some really good players on that defensive line and up the middle. Kenny Clark is as good a nose tackle, as you'll find. They paid him as such, but for whatever reason, it just hasn't translated.
And that was gas because I'm glad you brought the run defense because this team, obviously, with Heineke going in the game, they're going to want to run the ball and all that. Last thing with their D, like, what do you remember their thoughts on Heineke was last year? Do you recall anything from that one? Because that, they only scored 10 points in the game between the 20s, struggled in the red zone.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I think everybody remembered about that game was what Heineke did with his feet, right? I don't have it in front of me, but I think he was over 90. He was either at or over 90 yards rushing. in that game. And, some huge breakdowns. And look, we saw that from the Packers defense 2 weeks ago against Daniel Jones. I mean, Daniel Jones of the Giants, he hurt him more with his legs than he did with his arms. There were a couple drives late in that third quarter, fourth quarter against the Giants in London where it looked like they had these guys in third and manageable, 3rd and 8. And Daniel Jones, there were 2 times it was just a straight up quarterback draw on like 3rd and 6, and you can't stop that. That's trouble.
Yep. There you go. Rob, looking forward to seeing you on Sunday. And there you go. You got anything you want to plug? Anything that's noteworthy coming up?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned my story that's up right now.
Yeah.
I basically took apart the offense from position by position and went through all the reasons that they're struggling on offense and, kind of what some of the guys' thoughts on what they need to do and why they're in this position. So, check that out. You'll have a pretty good feel for what the Packers' issues are on offense.
And for the optimistic Commanders fans, if they're still out there, they can say, hey, there's a chance, because the pessimistic ones are going to say, well, this is the week the Packers get healthy. So know this fan base well, Rob. Thanks a lot for coming on. You're the best.
You got it, John.
That's it for this episode. Thanks to Rob for joining me, and thank you, as always, for listening. I'll be back on Friday with my keys to the game and a prediction. I'll talk to you next time.